Caitlin Wilde stared at her reflection in the full-length mirror, her fingers brushing nervously against the silk of her wedding dress. It was flawless, everything about it screamed perfection, just like the life she was supposed to lead. Yet as she gazed at herself, she felt as though the fabric was suffocating her, each stitch tightening around her chest. The weight of the veil, the layers of lace, the expectations, it was all too much. The woman staring back at her wasn't Caitlin Wilde, it was the version of herself that her parents and society had meticulously crafted. She was supposed to be marrying Gregory Clark today, a man she had known for years, a man who checked off every box her family had deemed essential for a suitable husband. He was successful, charming, well-connected, a man who had the world at his feet. But none of that mattered. Caitlin had never felt a spark for Greg, never once experienced that flutter in her chest when he held her hand. In fact, she couldn't remember the last time she was truly happy in his presence. She had been with him out of obligation, out of duty, out of love for her family, not out of love for him. Her parents had spent months planning the wedding, putting together a guest list that included the who's who of their social circle. Everything was in place, the church, the reception, the perfect honeymoon destination. But Caitlin couldn't shake the feeling that it was all a lie, a show for everyone else. And deep down, she knew that if she went through with it, she would spend the rest of her life pretending to be something she wasn't. A smile that never quite reached her eyes, a life of constant expectations, living in the shadow of a marriage that wasn't hers to begin with. With a trembling sigh, she slowly unzipped the back of the gown, letting the fabric fall to the floor. She stood in the middle of her room in nothing but her slip, the cool air of the morning sending shivers down her spine. For the first time in months, Caitlin felt the heavy burden of her choices lift, even if only for a moment. She wasn't sure what she was running from, but she knew that if she didn't leave now, she would be trapped forever. Without any further thought, she grabbed her phone and sent a message to her best friend, telling her she needed space and would be back soon. But Caitlin wasn't planning to go back. She couldn't. The thought of walking down that aisle, of facing Greg and all the guests, made her stomach twist in knots. So she did what any desperate woman in her situation would do, she ran. She slipped into a pair of jeans and a hoodie, throwing on a jacket as she grabbed her purse and keys. She didn't tell anyone where she was going. Caitlin wasn't even sure where she was headed, she just needed to get away. The first place that came to mind was the small town she had visited a few months ago, a quiet place near the mountains where no one knew her name. A place where she could escape the madness for a while and figure out who she was outside of the roles others had imposed upon her. Her heart raced as she drove through the streets of the city, the familiar buildings and landmarks blurring past her. For the first time in ages, she felt a sense of freedom she hadn't known she'd been missing. She didn't know how long she'd been driving, but eventually, she arrived at the small, sleepy town nestled at the foot of the mountains. The streets were quiet, the kind of quiet that almost felt sacred, and the air smelled of pine and fresh earth. She parked her car and wandered down the main street, looking for something, anything, that would take her mind off the wedding. The last thing she wanted to do was think about her family's disappointment, the weight of the ring that was still heavy on her finger. She found herself at a small cafe, a quaint place with warm lights shining through the windows, the smell of coffee and pastries drifting out into the crisp evening air. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The cafe was almost empty, save for a man sitting at a table by the window, absorbed in a book. His dark hair was messy, his clothes casually thrown together, and there was something about him that made Caitlin pause. He wasn't the type of man she would usually notice, not the type she was used to being around. His presence felt different, more grounded, less polished than the men she was used to in her life back home. She didn't know why, but something about him intrigued her. She ordered a coffee, then hesitated. Should she sit? Should she leave? She felt so out of place in this quiet town, so disconnected from everything she had known. But before she could decide, the man looked up from his book, his eyes meeting hers for the first time. He didn't say anything, but there was a knowing in his gaze, something unspoken that made her feel as though he could see right through her. "Would you mind if I joined you?" Caitlin asked, her voice unsure, but something inside of her urging her to take a chance. The man set down his book and nodded, motioning to the empty chair across from him. Please. I'm just reading, anyway. No reason why we can't have a conversation. As she sat down, Caitlin felt an odd sense of relief. She wasn't sure why, but talking to this stranger felt different than any conversation she had had in months. She didn't have to pretend. She didn't have to smile and make small talk or worry about what people thought of her. Here, she was just another person in a small town, sitting in a cozy cafe with a man she didn't know and who didn't seem to expect anything from her. They talked for hours, the conversation flowing effortlessly. She found herself laughing more than she had in ages, and as the night wore on, Caitlin realized that she hadn't once thought about the wedding or the life waiting for her back home. She was just, here. The man introduced himself as Evan Ross, though he didn't go into much detail about his own life. Caitlin didn't press, she didn't need to know his story. For the first time, she was more focused on her own feelings, her own need to be free, to be herself. Evan seemed to understand, and for reasons she couldn't explain, Caitlin felt safe with him. He wasn't asking anything of her. He wasn't trying to fix her. He just listened. By the time the cafe closed, Caitlin realized how late it had gotten. She felt a pang of regret at the thought of leaving this moment behind. Evan, sensing her unease, made a suggestion that took her completely by surprise. "Why don't you stay the night?" he said softly, almost as if reading her thoughts. "I know a place not far from here. It's quiet, peaceful, and you can clear your head." At first, Caitlin hesitated. She had only just met him, after all. But something in his tone, something in his eyes, told her that he wasn't asking for anything more than her company. Maybe this was exactly what she needed, some time away, away from everything she thought she was supposed to do, away from the life she had been running from for so long. "I'll take you up on that," Caitlin said, her voice barely a whisper. And with that, she followed Evan out into the night, stepping further into the unknown, leaving behind the life she had always known. The night felt like a promise of something new, something different. It was a step into the darkness, yes, but it was also a step toward freedom. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Caitlin wasn't afraid. The morning after her night with Evan felt different in ways Caitlin couldn't quite explain. The usual fog of anxiety that clouded her thoughts about the wedding and the life she was supposed to lead seemed to have lifted, if only for a moment. She awoke slowly, the early sunlight casting a warm glow through the small window of Evan's cabin. The room was simple but comfortable, wooden floors, mismatched furniture, and the faint scent of pine that seemed to cling to everything. She could hear the distant sound of birds outside, chirping their morning songs. For a fleeting moment, Caitlin felt as though she had stepped out of her own life, into a place where nothing expected anything from her. It was an unfamiliar kind of peace, but it was exactly what she needed. Evan was already awake. She could hear him moving around in the small kitchen, the smell of coffee drifting in from the other room. Caitlin sat up, the soft sheets around her feeling almost foreign, as though she had spent the night in a different world altogether. She didn't know what she had expected when she'd agreed to come with Evan, but it certainly hadn't been this calm, this quiet. There were no demands, no pressure to fit into the role she had been assigned for her entire life. She stood up and slipped into the robe that had been left out for her. The soft fabric felt like a cocoon around her, a small moment of comfort in the uncertainty of everything else. As she walked into the kitchen, she found Evan pouring 2 cups of coffee, his back to her. His presence, usually so calm and composed, felt like a gentle anchor, but there was something deeper, something she hadn't yet figured out about him. He seemed entirely unaffected by her decision to spend the night with him, as though nothing about it was out of the ordinary. "Morning," Caitlin said, her voice softer than usual, as though she were waking from a dream. Evan turned, offering her a smile that seemed too easy, too natural. It was the kind of smile that could make anyone feel as if they had known him for years, as if they had always been in each other's lives. "Good morning," he replied. His voice was low, gravelly, as if he hadn't used it much this early. He handed her one of the cups and gestured toward the small wooden table by the window. "I wasn't sure what you liked, so I made it black. Hope that's okay." Caitlin took the cup from him, the warmth of the coffee seeping into her hands, and sat at the table, watching the light play across the wooden beams of the cabin. "It's perfect," she said, taking a sip. The rich flavor spread through her, waking her up in a way nothing else had. There was a comfortable silence between them for a while. Caitlin found herself lost in the peacefulness of the moment. She had spent so long running from the noise of her own life, her obligations, her expectations, that she had forgotten what it felt like to simply exist, without purpose or reason. Evan seemed to understand that. He didn't push her to talk, didn't try to fill the silence with idle conversation. It was a rare gift, and Caitlin realized she had missed it more than she cared to admit. "So, what happens now?" she asked, breaking the silence at last. The question had been bubbling in her mind all morning, and now, with Evan seated across from her, it felt right to ask. It was the first time she had thought about the future in this new context, away from the wedding, away from everything she thought she knew. Evan took a moment before answering, his eyes thoughtful, almost distant. "Now?" he repeated. "Well, you're free, Caitlin. The world is yours to do with what you want. There's no right answer, no wrong way to go about it." Her heart fluttered at his words. Free. It was the first time anyone had said it aloud. And for the first time, she felt the weight of that freedom. The enormity of it. "But what about you?" Caitlin asked. "You're not here for no reason. There's something you're not telling me." Evan's expression flickered for a moment, the easy smile he had worn earlier replaced by a shadow, something fleeting that Caitlin couldn't quite grasp. He set his cup down and leaned back in his chair, his eyes studying her, as if trying to decide how much to reveal. "I'm not here to push you into anything," he said quietly, his voice serious now. "But if you want the truth, it's complicated." Caitlin didn't press him further. She could see that he was holding something back, something important. There was a part of her that wanted to know everything about him, to understand why he was here and why they had met in this strange, fateful way. But another part of her, perhaps the smarter part, knew that she wasn't ready to dive into that yet. She had her own baggage to sort through, her own mess of emotions and thoughts to untangle before she could even begin to understand his. Instead, she just nodded. "I get it. I don't think I'm ready to figure all of that out either. I don't know what I'm doing, Evan. Everything's been so planned for me, my whole life. And I've just been going along with it, pretending it's fine, pretending I'm fine. But I'm not." She looked down into her coffee cup, feeling the sting of the truth settling in her chest. She wasn't fine. She wasn't even close. Evan studied her for a long moment, as though weighing his words carefully. Finally, he spoke again, his voice softer now. "You don't have to have it all figured out, Caitlin. You don't owe anyone an answer right away. You're allowed to take time for yourself." She looked up at him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. It was the first time anyone had told her that, too, that it was okay not to know what came next. That it was okay to not have the entire rest of her life planned out in perfect detail. Evan's gaze softened, his eyes holding something unspoken, something deep. "The truth is, Caitlin, you're not the only one who's been running from something. We're all running from something. But that doesn't mean we have to keep running forever. Sometimes the best thing you can do is stop. Just stop and breathe." She didn't know why, but in that moment, she believed him. There was something about his calmness, his steadiness, that made her feel as if everything might just be okay. Maybe not right away, and maybe not in the ways she had expected, but in time. For the first time in ages, Caitlin let herself breathe. The air in the cabin felt clean and refreshing, and she felt as if she were taking in more than just the physical air around her. It was as if she were inhaling new possibilities, new choices that hadn't existed before. Later that day, they decided to take a walk through the woods behind the cabin. The trees towered over them, their branches swaying gently in the breeze, and the sound of rustling leaves filled the silence between them. They didn't need words, the peacefulness of the forest was enough. For the first time, Caitlin felt like she was truly alone, with no expectations hanging over her, no looming wedding or obligations to fulfill. She was simply walking, breathing, living in the moment. It was the kind of peace she had longed for, but never thought she would find. And as they walked, side by side, Caitlin realized that maybe she didn't need to figure everything out just yet. Maybe, for once, it was okay to simply be. Caitlin woke the next morning with an unsettling feeling in her chest. The sun had already begun to rise, and the early light poured through the cabin's small windows, casting soft shadows across the wooden floors. She could hear the sounds of birds outside, the wind rustling through the trees, but inside, there was a tension she couldn't shake. The world outside felt still and calm, but in her mind, everything was in motion, spinning too fast for her to keep up. Last night had been so different from everything she knew. The freedom, the quiet, the space to think without the weight of her responsibilities. She had never realized how much pressure she had been carrying until it was gone. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of peace, but now, that peace was beginning to crack under the weight of reality. She had left everything behind, her family, her wedding, her future. The thought of her life, the one she had been running from, loomed over her now like a dark cloud. Her wedding day was still set for the following week. She had promised herself that she would return, that she would face the inevitable, but now that she was so far removed from it all, the idea of going back felt almost unbearable. She had no idea what to do, or who to talk to, but it was clear to her now that she couldn't go back to the life she had so carefully planned. She sat up in bed, her legs dangling over the side as she rubbed her eyes, trying to gather her thoughts. She had been so focused on escaping, on running from her own life, that she hadn't thought about what would happen once she had the space to breathe. And now, she had to figure it out. Evan had been quietly making coffee when she came out of the bedroom. He was standing in front of the kitchen counter, his back to her as he fiddled with the French press. The morning light caught the edges of his dark hair, casting it in a soft glow, and for a moment, Caitlin simply watched him, unsure of what to say. There was something calming about his presence, something that made her feel like she wasn't completely alone, even though she was facing the uncertainty of her life. "Morning," she said quietly, crossing the room and sitting at the small kitchen table. Evan turned to face her, offering a small smile as he poured the freshly brewed coffee into 2 mugs. He slid one toward her and took a seat across from her. The simple act of sharing a moment with him, just the two of them, with no expectations, felt like a luxury she wasn't used to. It was strange how easy it was to be around him, how natural the silence felt. "How'd you sleep?" Evan asked, his voice steady and warm. "Better than I thought," Caitlin replied, taking a sip of the coffee. It was strong, just the way she liked it. For a moment, the warmth of the drink filled her, and she felt a sense of comfort she hadn't realized she needed. She looked at him, unsure of how to start. She didn't want to burden him with her thoughts, but at the same time, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted inside her. She needed to talk, to make sense of everything that had been happening. "Evan," she began, her voice hesitant, "I can't go back. I mean, not like this." He looked at her with understanding, as though he had been expecting her to say something like this. "I didn't think you would," he said softly. "But you don't have to decide anything right now. You've got time." Caitlin's hands trembled slightly as she set her mug down on the table. "I don't think I have as much time as I thought I did," she admitted, her voice quiet, almost breaking. "I mean, I've been running from this wedding, from my life, and now I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I can't just go back and pretend it's fine. I don't even know if I'm capable of pretending anymore." Evan's gaze softened. "You don't have to pretend, Caitlin. Not with me." She looked up at him, her chest tightening. There was a comfort in his words, an honesty that she had rarely found in anyone else. He wasn't trying to fix her or tell her what to do. He wasn't offering some quick solution. Instead, he was just there, offering her a space to breathe, to exist without pressure or expectations. "I don't even know who I am anymore," Caitlin whispered, the vulnerability in her voice catching her off guard. "I've been so focused on what other people want from me, on being the person everyone expects me to be, that I've lost sight of myself. And now I'm here, and I don't even know what that means. I don't know what I want." Evan leaned back in his chair, studying her for a moment. He seemed to be choosing his words carefully, as if he understood the gravity of what she was saying. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm and steady. "You don't have to have it all figured out, Caitlin. Not right now. And not for anyone else but yourself. You've been living for everyone else for so long, it's okay to take a step back and figure out who you are without all the noise." She nodded slowly, the weight of his words sinking in. It felt almost too simple, too easy, but in a way, it was exactly what she needed to hear. For so long, she had been overwhelmed by the expectations of her family, of Greg, of society. And now, Evan was telling her that it was okay to let go of that for a while. That it was okay to simply exist. But even as she sat there, listening to Evan, Caitlin couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, that she wasn't seeing the full picture. There was still the matter of her family, her life back home, and the promises she had made. She could feel the pressure building again, the familiar weight of responsibility pressing down on her. "I wish it were that simple," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But I can't just walk away from everything. I can't just leave my life behind and pretend like nothing matters. There are people who are counting on me, people who have invested in this wedding, in this future I'm supposed to have. It's not just about me." Evan was silent for a long moment, his gaze never leaving hers. "I understand," he said finally, his voice softer now. "But you have to understand, Caitlin, that this is your life. Not theirs. You don't owe anyone an explanation for how you feel, for what you need. You owe it to yourself to make a decision that's true to who you are, not who they want you to be." She swallowed hard, the lump in her throat threatening to overwhelm her. He was right, of course. But it was easier said than done. She had spent her entire life living for other people. Her parents' expectations, Greg's hopes for the future, they had all shaped the person she had become. And now, here she was, standing on the edge of something new, but she had no idea how to jump. "I don't know if I can do this," Caitlin whispered, more to herself than to Evan. "I don't know if I can change my whole life in one moment." Evan leaned forward, his eyes filled with quiet determination. "You don't have to change everything at once. You just have to start. One step. And I'll be here to help you through it. You don't have to do it alone." For the first time in what felt like forever, Caitlin allowed herself to believe it. She didn't have all the answers. She didn't know what her future held. But for the first time, she didn't feel so alone in the uncertainty. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first step toward finding herself again. The days that followed felt like an endless blur to Caitlin. The peace she had found with Evan, that delicate and fragile sense of freedom, began to feel more like an illusion as the weight of her responsibilities crept back into her thoughts. She tried to quiet the nagging voice in her head that kept reminding her of the wedding she had left behind, but the more she tried to ignore it, the louder it became. The longer she stayed away, the harder it became to pretend that she could simply walk away from everything she had built up over the years. Evan didn't push her to make any decisions. He didn't demand that she pick a path or define what their connection meant. His presence, calm and unwavering, was both a comfort and a challenge. Caitlin found herself torn between the life she had known, the life she had been expected to lead, and the unknown, uncharted territory she found herself exploring with him. She had started to understand what it meant to live without the constraints of her old life, but at the same time, the weight of her past was never far behind. It hovered over her like a shadow, always present, always reminding her that she couldn't escape it forever. One afternoon, Caitlin found herself standing on the porch of the cabin, staring out at the landscape in front of her. The mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks shrouded in mist, and the air was crisp with the scent of pine. It was a view she had come to love during her time here, a reminder of the simplicity she had been craving for so long. But despite the beauty of it all, Caitlin felt a pang of guilt stir in her chest. She hadn't heard from her family since she left. She had cut off all communication, afraid of what they might say, of the questions they might ask. Her mother's voice in her head had been a constant presence in her life, demanding perfection, pushing her toward a future that didn't feel like hers. Caitlin had always done what was expected of her, always followed the rules, but now, standing on this porch, she realized just how much she had sacrificed in the process. She didn't even know if she wanted the life she had been promised. All of the carefully planned milestones, finishing school, getting married, starting a family, none of it felt right anymore. She wasn't sure if it had ever felt right. She had done everything to please her family, but in the end, none of it had been for her. A sharp knock on the door broke her reverie. Caitlin turned, her heart skipping a beat. She knew who it was before she even opened the door. Greg stood there, looking every bit the man she had once thought she could marry. His dark hair was neatly combed, and he was dressed in a sharp suit, as though he had walked straight out of one of the countless meetings that had consumed his life. His blue eyes were intense, but they softened when they saw her. "Caitlin," he said, his voice a mixture of relief and frustration. "I've been looking everywhere for you. We need to talk." Caitlin stood frozen for a moment, unsure of how to respond. She had known this moment was coming, had known that she couldn't avoid her old life forever. But the reality of it, seeing Greg standing there, just as polished and perfect as ever, made her heart ache in ways she hadn't anticipated. "I didn't want to talk to you like this," Greg continued, his voice lowering as he stepped closer. "But you can't just run away and expect everything to be okay. You owe me an explanation, Caitlin. We were about to get married. Our families were counting on us." She felt a pang of guilt at his words, but it was quickly replaced by something else. Something more complicated. "I didn't run away because I didn't want to talk to you," Caitlin replied, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I ran away because I didn't want to lie anymore. I didn't want to marry you, Greg. I don't want to live the life I've been living. And I can't pretend anymore." Greg looked taken aback, his eyes widening in shock. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice rising. "Caitlin, we were supposed to be happy together. I thought you felt the same way." "I did," she said, shaking her head, her words coming out more softly. "I thought I did, too. But I was only living a life that you wanted for me. I was living a life my parents wanted for me. And now I'm realizing that it's not my life at all. It's never been my life." Greg's expression faltered, his eyes searching hers for some hint of the woman he had thought he knew. "So that's it? You're just going to walk away from everything? From me? From our families? From the future we've built together?" Caitlin took a deep breath, trying to calm the turmoil inside of her. "I don't want to hurt anyone, Greg. But I can't keep doing this. I can't keep pretending that this is what I want. And I'm sorry, but I need to find my own way. I need to figure out who I am, without all of this." There was a long silence between them, and Caitlin could see the pain and confusion in Greg's eyes. He wanted her to stay, to be the woman he had always believed she was. But Caitlin knew she couldn't do that. She had tried to be that woman for so long, but in the end, it had never been enough. "I think you've already made up your mind," Greg said quietly, his shoulders sagging. "But Caitlin, this isn't just about you. It's about all of us. You can't just walk away from everything and expect no consequences." Caitlin nodded, her heart heavy with guilt. "I know," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "And I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt you, Greg. But I can't keep living a lie." Greg didn't respond at first. He stood there, looking at her with a mix of hurt and resignation, before finally shaking his head. I don't know what else to say. I thought we had something real, Caitlin. But if you're not willing to fight for it, then I guess there's nothing left for us. Caitlin's chest tightened as she watched him turn and walk away. She wanted to call after him, to beg him to understand, but she knew that she couldn't. She couldn't keep holding on to something that was never truly hers to begin with. As Greg disappeared down the path, Caitlin felt the weight of the decision she had just made settle over her. She wasn't sure if it was the right decision. She wasn't sure if she would ever be able to make peace with the pain she had caused. But in that moment, standing on the porch of the cabin, she knew that she had made the only choice she could. For the first time in her life, she was choosing herself. It was terrifying, and it hurt, but it was also liberating. Caitlin wasn't sure where her path would take her from here, but she knew one thing for sure: she couldn't go back. Not to Greg. Not to her family. Not to the life she had been running from for so long. She turned back into the cabin, the weight of the world still heavy on her shoulders, but for the first time, it felt like it was her burden to bear. The only question now was whether she was strong enough to carry it. The days after Greg left felt like an endless cascade of emotions, each one more intense than the last. Caitlin spent most of her time in the cabin, pacing through the rooms or sitting by the window, watching the world outside but feeling disconnected from it all. There was a strange kind of stillness in the air, a quiet that made her feel both calm and unsettled. She had made the decision to leave her old life behind, but the weight of that decision was heavier than she had imagined. She thought that walking away from Greg and the life she had built would bring her peace, but it didn't. It was as though she had opened a door, but what lay beyond it was a dark void, and she had no idea how to navigate it. Evan, as always, was a steady presence in the midst of her turmoil. He gave her space when she needed it, but also made sure she knew he was there. The mornings were quiet, with the two of them drinking coffee in companionable silence, but Caitlin could feel the tension between them growing. She couldn't deny the connection she felt with him, but she wasn't ready to acknowledge it, at least, not yet. There were still so many questions swirling in her mind about her future, about who she was, and about the life she had left behind. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Evan suggested they take a walk through the woods. Caitlin agreed, needing to get out of her head for a while. She pulled on her jacket and followed him down the familiar path that led into the forest behind the cabin. The trees, tall and imposing, stretched out into the distance, their branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal arms. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of pine and damp soil. The walk started out in silence, both of them lost in their thoughts. Caitlin's mind was a swirl of emotions, guilt, fear, uncertainty, but as they walked deeper into the forest, the overwhelming noise inside her mind began to quiet. The rhythm of her footsteps on the soft earth, the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze, helped clear the fog. Still, the feeling of loss lingered, settling heavily in her chest. Eventually, they reached a clearing, and Evan stopped, turning to face her. The soft glow of the setting sun illuminated his features, casting a warm light across his face. Caitlin could see the concern in his eyes, the quiet way he was watching her. It was as if he could read her thoughts without her having to say a word. "You've been quiet lately," he said, his voice gentle, as though he were trying to coax something out of her. "What's going on in that head of yours?" Caitlin hesitated. She wasn't sure she wanted to voice the thoughts that had been gnawing at her. She didn't want to burden him with her confusion, but at the same time, she realized how much she needed to talk. She couldn't keep carrying this weight alone. So, after a long pause, she spoke. "I don't know who I am anymore," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "I mean, I've always known who I was supposed to be. The perfect daughter. The perfect fiancée. The perfect future wife. But now I feel like I've lost myself. I've been so focused on what everyone else wanted from me that I've completely forgotten what I want." Her words hung in the air between them, and Caitlin felt a surge of vulnerability flood over her. She hadn't meant to say so much, but once the floodgates had opened, it felt impossible to stop. It was as though the dam inside her had cracked, and all the things she had buried deep within her were rushing to the surface. Evan didn't say anything for a long time. Instead, he took a step closer to her, his gaze never leaving hers. There was an intensity in his eyes that made Caitlin's heart race, but she couldn't bring herself to look away. She had been running for so long, running from her life, from her decisions, and now, standing in front of him, she felt like she was at a crossroads, unsure of which direction to take. "You've spent your whole life trying to be what everyone else wanted," Evan said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "But you've never really given yourself the chance to be who you are. The real you. You don't have to have everything figured out right now, Caitlin. You don't have to know where this path will lead. But you have to start with being honest with yourself." His words hit her like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just about finding herself, it was about acknowledging everything she had been ignoring for so long. She had been so wrapped up in pleasing others, in fulfilling their expectations, that she had never asked herself what she truly wanted, what made her happy, what made her feel alive. "I'm scared," Caitlin admitted, her voice breaking as she spoke. "I don't know how to let go of everything I've built. I don't know how to step into the unknown." Evan reached out, gently taking her hand in his. His touch was warm, steady, and it sent a wave of comfort through her. For the first time in days, Caitlin felt like she could breathe. "You don't have to do it alone," he said softly. "You don't have to have all the answers right now. But you have to trust yourself. Trust that you'll figure it out. And trust that no matter what happens, you're not alone. I'm here for you." His words wrapped around her like a lifeline, and Caitlin felt the knot in her chest loosen slightly. She hadn't realized just how much she needed to hear that, to know that she wasn't completely on her own in this. They stood there for a long moment, the world around them fading into the background. Caitlin could feel the weight of the past few days starting to shift, the heaviness that had settled in her chest loosening bit by bit. Maybe she didn't have all the answers. Maybe she didn't have a clear path ahead of her. But in that moment, standing in the woods with Evan, she realized that she had the power to choose. She could step into the unknown, and she didn't have to do it alone. As the last of the sun's rays dipped below the horizon, Caitlin felt a flicker of hope ignite within her. It wasn't a grand epiphany, but it was something. A small spark that had been buried beneath the weight of her fears, finally beginning to burn brighter. She looked up at Evan, her heart pounding in her chest, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel lost. She felt like maybe, just maybe, she could find her way again. "I don't know what's going to happen next," she said, her voice steady but full of emotion, "but I think I'm ready to find out." Evan smiled, his expression warm and understanding. "That's all you need. One step at a time." They stood there in the fading light, hand in hand, and for the first time in as long as Caitlin could remember, she felt like the future wasn't something to fear. It was something to embrace. The morning after their walk in the woods, Caitlin woke up with a different feeling in her chest. The usual heaviness, the constant weight of indecision that had followed her for months, was still there, but it was somehow lighter. It was as if Evan's words, his quiet understanding, had planted a seed inside her that was slowly starting to sprout. She didn't know how to explain it, but it felt like the first time in a long time that she could see a way forward, even if it was only a small sliver of light breaking through the darkness. It wasn't that the decision to leave her old life behind had suddenly become easy. The thought of confronting her family, facing Greg, and dealing with the consequences of her actions still filled her with anxiety. But something had shifted. She no longer felt like she was running from the inevitable. She was taking control, step by step, no matter how small those steps were. She spent the next few days lost in her thoughts, trying to figure out what her next move would be. Every time she thought about going back to her family, about facing the wedding that had been planned for months, her stomach would tighten with dread. She couldn't go back. She couldn't walk down that aisle and pretend that everything was fine. But at the same time, she didn't want to leave things unresolved forever. She had to confront the truth, for herself and for everyone else involved. Evan, sensing her growing restlessness, suggested they take a day trip to the nearby town. Caitlin didn't have any particular reason for wanting to go, but the idea of getting away from the cabin, away from the silence that had become so overwhelming, was appealing. Maybe she needed a change of scenery to help clear her mind. They left early in the morning, driving through the winding roads that led them to the small town. The town was quaint, with cobblestone streets lined with little shops and cafes. It was the kind of place where time seemed to slow down, where everyone knew each other's names and nothing ever moved too fast. Caitlin couldn't remember the last time she had visited a place like this. It felt like another world compared to the one she had left behind. They spent the day walking through the streets, stopping at a few shops, and grabbing lunch at a cozy cafe. It was nice to be out in the world again, even if only for a short time. The distractions helped, but the truth was that Caitlin couldn't shake the gnawing feeling inside her. She kept thinking about Greg, about her family, and about the life she had left behind. It was hard to escape the weight of it, no matter how far she went. As they were walking back to the car, Caitlin noticed a small bookstore tucked away in a corner of the street. It wasn't much, just a tiny shop with old wooden shelves overflowing with books, but something about it called to her. She paused for a moment, looking at Evan. "Do you mind if we go in for a bit?" she asked, her voice soft. Evan smiled and nodded. "Of course. Let's see what we can find." The bell above the door jingled as they stepped inside, and the musty smell of old paper filled the air. Caitlin wandered through the aisles, running her fingers along the spines of the books. She hadn't realized how much she missed the quiet escape of reading, how much it had helped her center herself in the past. She found a small corner of the store where a few comfortable chairs were set up, perfect for reading, and sat down with a book she had picked out at random. Evan, sensing her need for space, left her to her thoughts while he wandered around the store. She found herself getting lost in the pages of the novel, the story transporting her to a place far away from her own life. It was easier to forget about the chaos in her own mind when she was wrapped up in someone else's world. But after a while, the quiet of the bookstore began to weigh on her again. The uncertainty, the feeling that she was missing something crucial, crept back into her thoughts. When Evan returned, he found her sitting with the book still in her lap, her eyes distant. He sat down next to her, a quiet understanding in his gaze. Caitlin set the book aside and let out a long breath, her fingers nervously tapping on the cover. "I don't know what to do, Evan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I keep thinking about everything I've left behind. About Greg, about my parents, about everything I thought I wanted. And it just feels like I'm losing everything. Like I'm losing who I was." Evan's eyes softened, and he reached out, placing a hand on hers. His touch was warm, grounding, as though he were anchoring her in the storm that was swirling inside her. "You're not losing who you are, Caitlin," he said gently. "You're just finding out who you really are. And that's not easy. It's not supposed to be easy. But you don't have to carry the weight of it all on your own. You've been living for everyone else for so long. It's time to live for yourself." His words, simple yet powerful, sank deep into her. She had been so focused on what everyone else expected from her that she had never allowed herself to truly live for herself. She had built a life based on other people's needs and desires, and now, standing in this small bookstore, she realized that she had never stopped to consider what she wanted. "I don't know how to do that," Caitlin admitted, her voice small and uncertain. "I've spent my whole life following the rules. How do I just stop? How do I choose something different?" Evan squeezed her hand, his smile faint but warm. "You start by giving yourself permission. You don't have to have it all figured out. You just have to give yourself the freedom to choose something for yourself, no matter how small it is. You don't have to know the whole path, Caitlin. You just have to take one step forward. That's how it starts." Caitlin looked at him, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't about having all the answers. It was about giving herself the freedom to ask the questions. She didn't have to have it all figured out right now. She could take it one day at a time. And for the first time, that didn't scare her. As they left the bookstore and walked back to the car, Caitlin felt lighter, like a burden had been lifted, even if only slightly. She wasn't sure what would come next, but she no longer felt like she was running from her own life. She was taking control, step by step. And that was enough for now. She wasn't alone. She had Evan by her side, and maybe, just maybe, she could find her way back to herself. The next few days passed in a haze of quiet reflection. Caitlin spent more time walking through the woods, sitting by the lake near the cabin, and trying to make sense of everything that had happened. The conversations with Evan had left a deep impression on her, the calm assurance he had offered her acting like a steady thread in a life that felt torn apart. Yet, despite the solace she found in these moments of solitude, the questions, the doubts, continued to swirl around her. She had been running from one life, but now she found herself standing at a crossroads, unsure of which path to take. Her old life felt like a distant memory, one she had long since outgrown, but the reality of the choices she now faced was no easier. How did one simply walk away from everything? How did one pick up the pieces of a life that had been carefully constructed by the expectations of others? One evening, Caitlin was sitting on the porch of the cabin, looking out over the vast expanse of forest that surrounded them. The sun was just beginning to set, casting a golden hue over the landscape. The world felt so quiet, so peaceful, and for a brief moment, Caitlin allowed herself to forget about the storm that was still raging inside her. Her phone, which had been silent for days, buzzed in her pocket, pulling her back to reality. She hesitated before answering, knowing exactly who it was. She had been avoiding her family's calls for days, but the guilt of not answering them was starting to weigh heavily on her. She took a deep breath and pressed the green button to answer. Caitlin, her mother's voice crackled through the phone, sounding both relieved and tense. "Where have you been? We've been trying to reach you for days. Your father and I are worried. You can't just disappear like this." Caitlin closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her mother's words like a physical pressure on her chest. She had known this conversation was coming, but she wasn't prepared for how it would make her feel. She had hoped that some distance, some time to think, would help her find the courage to face this moment. But now, hearing her mother's voice, the old patterns, the old expectations, came flooding back. "I'm okay, Mom," Caitlin said, her voice quieter than she intended. "I just needed some time to think." "Time to think," her mother repeated, her voice rising with a mix of concern and confusion. "About what, Caitlin? You're getting married in just a few days. There's nothing to think about. You've made your choice, haven't you?" Caitlin's heart tightened at her mother's words. They were exactly what she had been trying to avoid, the assumption that everything had already been decided for her. That her life, her future, was already mapped out in someone else's mind. "Mom, Caitlin paused, taking a breath, trying to steady herself. "I can't go through with it. I can't marry Greg. This isn't the life I want. I've spent so long trying to make everyone happy, trying to do what's expected of me. But I've never stopped to ask myself what I really want." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Caitlin's fingers tightened around the phone as she waited for her mother's response, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the familiar tension building, the fear that she was about to disappoint everyone, that she was going to be seen as selfish, reckless, foolish. Finally, her mother spoke, her voice colder than before. "Caitlin, this is absurd. You're throwing everything away. Do you understand how much time and effort your father and I have put into this wedding? This isn't just about you and your feelings. It's about family, tradition, respect. Do you think you can just walk away from all of that?" Caitlin's eyes burned as she fought back the tears that threatened to spill over. She had heard these words before. The weight of family tradition, the pressure of expectations, all of it wrapped up in the idea that her life was not her own. She had been living for others for so long that she wasn't sure who she was anymore. "I'm sorry, Mom," Caitlin whispered, her voice cracking. "But I have to do this for myself. I can't keep pretending that this is the life I want. I need to figure out who I really am, without everyone else telling me who I'm supposed to be." There was another long pause, and Caitlin could hear the faint sound of her mother's breathing on the other end of the line. The silence stretched on, uncomfortable and heavy, until finally, her mother spoke again, her voice colder than ever. "If this is really what you want, Caitlin," she said, her tone sharp, "then there's nothing more to say. But don't expect me to ever forgive you for this. You've broken everything we've worked for. Everything we've built. You've destroyed it all." With that, her mother hung up. Caitlin stood there, the phone still pressed to her ear, the deafening silence filling the space around her. She didn't know whether to feel relieved or devastated. She had finally said the words she had been avoiding, had finally taken a stand for herself, but it felt like she had lost something in the process. Something important. Her mind was a whirlpool of thoughts and emotions, but through it all, one thing became clear to her. She had made the right decision. It was painful, yes, but it was the only way she could begin to find herself. It wasn't about rejecting her family or her past, it was about embracing her own truth, whatever that looked like. As the sky darkened and the first stars began to appear, Caitlin sat down on the porch, her legs drawn up to her chest. She let the cool air wash over her, the weight of the conversation with her mother still heavy in her chest but not enough to crush her. She had faced her fear, and now she had to move forward. When Evan joined her a few minutes later, he didn't ask about the call. He didn't need to. His quiet presence was all she needed. Without a word, he sat down next to her, his arm brushing hers in a small, comforting gesture. "I don't know what comes next," Caitlin said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I know I can't go back. I can't keep living a life that isn't mine." Evan didn't say anything at first, but then he shifted closer, his hand resting gently on hers. "You don't have to know everything, Caitlin. You don't have to have all the answers right now. You just have to take it one step at a time. And whatever happens, I'm here." For the first time in what felt like forever, Caitlin allowed herself to believe him. She didn't have all the answers. She didn't know where her path would lead. But in that moment, she knew one thing for sure, she was done pretending. She was ready to walk forward, to face whatever came next. And for the first time, she wasn't alone. The days that followed the phone call with her mother felt like they existed in a different reality. Caitlin had made a choice, one that she couldn't take back, but it still felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down at a world she wasn't sure she could navigate. The pain of the conversation with her mother lingered, but there was also something else, something quieter, deeper. It was a sense of relief. A feeling that for the first time in years, Caitlin was truly standing up for herself. The cabin, once a peaceful retreat from her life, now felt like a place of transition. She wasn't sure how much longer she could stay here, hidden away from the world. Evan had been understanding, as he always was, but Caitlin knew that eventually, she would have to face the consequences of her decisions. She would have to face her family, face Greg, and figure out what kind of future she was going to build. But right now, it was hard to imagine anything beyond the present moment, beyond the small world that she had created for herself here. Evan hadn't pushed her to make any decisions. He had given her the space to find her own way, and that, in itself, was a kind of grace. He was there when she needed him, but he didn't try to rush her through the process. It was something Caitlin had come to appreciate more and more as the days passed. He didn't demand answers from her. He didn't try to solve her problems. He just let her be. And for that, she was grateful. One evening, Caitlin was sitting outside, her back against the cool wooden siding of the cabin, watching the sun dip below the horizon. It had been a long day, filled with too many thoughts and not enough answers. She had spent most of it wandering through the nearby woods, trying to sort through the chaos in her mind. The decision to leave Greg, to leave the life she had known, had been the hardest thing she had ever done, but it had also been the most freeing. It was strange, how something so painful could also bring a sense of peace. But she was learning that sometimes, in order to find peace, you had to let go of the things that held you back, even if it meant facing the unknown. As the sky darkened, Evan came outside and sat down next to her. He didn't say anything at first, just sat there, his presence a quiet reassurance that she wasn't alone. Caitlin leaned her head against the cabin wall and closed her eyes for a moment, letting the cool air settle around her. She didn't know how to explain it, but she felt like something was shifting inside her. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. It was as if the world was slowly starting to make sense again, even though she still had no idea what her next steps would be. "Have you decided what you want to do?" Evan asked, his voice soft but steady. It wasn't a question that demanded an immediate answer, but Caitlin could sense that he was trying to understand where she was in the process. She wasn't sure how to answer him. She had been thinking about it for days, but the truth was, she still didn't have the answer. "I'm not sure," she said, her voice carrying the weight of her uncertainty. "I know I can't go back to the way things were. I can't go back to Greg, and I can't go back to that life. But I also don't know what's next. I don't know what I'm supposed to do now." Evan nodded, as though he understood exactly what she was feeling. He had never pressured her to make a decision, never tried to push her in any one direction. He had been patient with her, waiting for her to figure things out on her own, and Caitlin appreciated that more than she could express. "You don't have to have it all figured out right now," he said, his voice calm. "It's okay not to know. It's okay to take your time. You've been living your life for everyone else for so long. It's okay to give yourself the time and space to figure out what you want." Caitlin turned her head to look at him, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she saw a flicker of hope in her chest. He wasn't asking her to have all the answers. He wasn't expecting her to fix everything overnight. He was simply reminding her that it was okay to take the time she needed, and that it was okay not to know what came next. "I think I'm finally starting to understand that," Caitlin said, her voice quieter now. "I've spent so long trying to live up to other people's expectations, trying to make everyone happy, that I've forgotten what it means to make myself happy. To live for myself, for my own dreams and desires. I don't know what that looks like yet, but I know it's something I need to figure out." Evan smiled, his eyes warm and understanding. "That's all any of us can do, Caitlin. Take it one step at a time. Figure out what makes you feel alive. And when you're ready, you'll know what comes next." There was a long silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that allowed Caitlin to reflect on everything that had happened, on everything that was still to come. She didn't have all the answers, and she didn't know how everything would turn out. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. The next morning, Caitlin woke up early, the light from the rising sun streaming through the window. She had slept restlessly, her mind still whirling with thoughts of her past and her future. But as she sat up in bed, the quiet of the cabin wrapping around her like a blanket, something inside her clicked. She didn't have to have it all figured out. She didn't have to have a perfect plan. All she had to do was keep moving forward, step by step, and trust that the answers would come. She found Evan outside, sitting on the porch, looking out at the forest. He looked up as she approached, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. Caitlin sat down beside him, feeling the cool morning air on her face. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was comfortable, a quiet understanding passing between them. Caitlin took a deep breath, her chest expanding with a sense of calm that had been absent for so long. "I think I'm ready to face it," she said, her voice steady. "I'm ready to face my family, to face Greg, and to figure out what comes next. I don't know how it will go, but I'm ready to take that first step." Evan turned to her, his eyes full of pride and quiet support. You've already taken the hardest step, Caitlin. You've chosen yourself. And that's all you need to do. Caitlin smiled, a small but genuine smile, and for the first time in a long time, she felt the weight of the world lift off her shoulders, even if just for a moment. She didn't know what the future held, but she was no longer afraid of it. She had found the courage to face it head-on, and that was enough. As they sat there together, the world stretching out before them, Caitlin knew that whatever came next, she would be okay. She had taken the first step toward finding herself again, and that was all she needed for now. The rest would come in time.